So good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Royal Institution. I wish it was in the physical, beautiful Faraday Lecture Theatre, but here we are doing our best live streaming. Tonight I'm going to be talking about my new book, The Pattern Seekers. And in this book, I address a big question. Is there a link between autism, the neurodevelopmental condition, and invention? And on the face of it, why would we expect any link at all? But what I hope to do during this evening's lecture is lay out some of the argument and some of the evidence to show that there is a link, and that this new science might change how we think about autism and how we think about the uniquely human capacity for invention. But before we get to that, we should sort of turn to maybe a much more fundamental question of when did invention begin? So some people argue that it was the presence of the earliest stone tools that our Homo ancestors were using as long ago as 2.1 million years ago that are signs of invention. So long before Homo sapiens was on the earth, maybe our Homo ancestors were inventing. Certainly they were producing stone axes like the one you can see here, to either use to smash or to cut or to scrape. So simple tools with limited functions. So this was Homo habilis, perhaps one of the earliest stone tool users. And another one of our Homo ancestors was Homo erectus, again going back as long as that, 2.1 million years ago. But this species of Homo lived as recently as 250,000 years ago. What you can see is that their stone axes had slightly changed in design. Some people might take that as a sign that they could invent something new. So the pattern, if you like, in their stone tools was slightly different. But I'm going to argue that actually these were still very simple tools, and what is very strikingly absent is any change in the design whilst that species lived. And then the other sort of well-known species of Homo that goes back 300,000 years were the Neanderthals. Again, you can see a slight change in the design of their stone axes, these Mousterian stone tools as they're called. They lived as recently as 40,000 years ago. But again, we can debate this, and maybe we will in the discussion afterwards. I'm going to argue that their tools equally were quite simple, with a very limited number of functions. New evidence is beginning to challenge this. It may be that Neanderthals were more capable than we previously thought in terms of stone tool invention. But importantly, you can see a lot of these sorts of simple stone tool use in other animals that are living today. So if we look at these at chimpanzees, for example, here's a chimp using a rock to crack a nut, so in the function of a hammer, to get the juicy insides. And even amongst birds, we see clearly very intelligent behavior. This crow is using a stone to drop into the water to raise the water level in this experiment so that the bird can reach the juicy worm. My thesis in the book and tonight is that actually what we see in species before Homo sapiens and what we see in living non-human animals today is certainly a sign that they could do intelligent things and that they could recognize patterns, but these patterns come under the heading of what psychologists call associative learning, where you form an association between two things, A and B. So if we go back to the chimpanzee, the association that the chimp is forming in his or her mind is that using the hammer leads to a reward, in this case getting the juicy insides of the nut. And particularly when B is something rewarding, the behavior then tends to get repeated. We tend to repeat what we enjoy. And that's very different, I think, to invention. But most strikingly, by the time humans, Homo sapiens, comes on the scene, around 300,000 years ago, and as they continue to evolve, I'm going to show you how there's a real explosion in invention, but invention of much more complex tools, and that something significant changed in the evolution of the human brain. So this schematic figure shows time along the horizontal axis, and I'm going to argue at around 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, there was a cognitive revolution, a change in the way Homo sapiens thought, and a change in their brain, giving rise to a sudden dramatic increase in the rate of invention. That for millions of years, our Homo ancestors before Homo sapiens were producing a small number of tools, but the rate of invention was really quite slow. And then suddenly it jumps up, and we still see it today, unstoppable invention, so that even within this year, we've seen the invention of a vaccine to combat the virus. So what was this cognitive revolution in the brain? Well, I'm going to argue that two new systems, two new mechanisms evolved in the human brain. And the first is what I call the systemizing mechanism. So the systemizing mechanism processes very special kinds of patterns. It's no longer just associative learning between A and B, but now our brains were looking for very special patterns that I call if and then patterns. And I'm going to show you some examples. I'm borrowing the idea of if and then from George Boole, the 19th century logician, who you can see in a cartoon figure here. But basically the idea is we look for these patterns, we find them, and then we repeat our experiments or our observations to confirm the pattern to see if it holds true. So let's look at, first of all, how engineers think about exactly the same patterns. Engineers tend to use a different set of terms. They talk about input, operation, output. I'm using the terms from logic, if, and, then. But you can see that the basic idea is that you can take any input, perform some kind of operation on the input, or observe an operation being performed on the input to see what happens to the output. So although it looks simple, I think it has complexity to it. And I'm going to argue that these if and then forms of thinking, it's a new logical way of thinking, underlies all of human invention. So what do we see in the archaeological record that would allow me to say that there'd been a significant change in how we think, or how Homo sapiens, modern Homo sapiens, was thinking? Well, one example is the bow and arrow. Tension in the fiber, then the arrow will fly. So we've got an subsequent inventions that modern humans were making. What else do we see in the archaeological record? Well, we see the first jewelry being invented in the form of a necklace. You can see that some of this is on a different league, a different level of complexity to those stone tools that we were looking at earlier. And not long after, we see the first musical instrument. This was a flute made out of the hollow bone from a bird. Again, I'm going to argue this if and then logic underlies both of these. Let's just go back to the necklace. What would be the if and then reasoning? If I take some beads and I drill holes in them and I put a thread through the holes, then I can make a necklace. So it's if and then. And you can add more ands into the algorithm, but it's the same basic logic. The earliest musical instrument that's been found, this hollow bone flute made from the bone of a bird. And if we put ourselves into the mind of the maker, the mind of the inventor, they would have been thinking something like this. If I blow down this hollow bone and cover one hole, then I make a particular sound. And then they might play with the patterns. If I blow down this hollow bone and uncover the hole, then it makes a different sound. So what we're seeing in this apparently simple, but actually I think complex new tool is that the inventor has made a system, and the minimal definition of a system are these if and then rules or patterns. They've only made a system which is a musical instrument where they could now create potentially an infinite number of sequences of sounds, but they've created music itself, another system of auditory patterns. And around that time, 40,000 years ago, we start to see the first cave paintings. We see, by 25,000 years ago, the first sculptures. By 23,000 years ago, more inventions or complex tools, which are the first sewing needles. And we see, by 13,000 years ago, the invention of agriculture. And again, let's just look at the application of that same algorithm in this new circuit in the brain, in the human brain. If I take a tomato seed and I plant it in moist soil, then I get a tomato plant. And, you know, the impact of these kinds of inventions was huge in terms of changing our diet, changing how we lived, changing our health, changing the size of our communities, but all of it deriving from this new ability to see, experiment, repeat, and play with these special patterns. Let's take the invention of mathematics, that if I take the number 3 and I cube it, then I get the number 27 every time. So part of what's special about these patterns is that you should get the same result every time. And whether we're talking about mathematicians or these days scientists, or those working in technology, or even those working in music, the point about these if and then patterns is that they're repeatable, and then you can start to vary some of the parts within the algorithm. So the if could be varied. You could take the number 4 instead of the number 3. The and could be varied. Instead of cubing it, you could square it, and then you would get a different output. But it's the same logic underlying it. Let's take something much more down to earth, like the invention of cooking. If I take an egg and put it in boiling water for 4 minutes, then the yolk will turn from soft yellow to hard yellow. So here we're seeing, if you like, experimenting with patterns in a very domestic sphere, cooking. So I've talked a bit about this new mechanism in the brain, the systemizing mechanism, which I think was one of the changes that constituted the cognitive revolution. But if we think about the jewelry, whilst we might have needed the systemizing mechanism with its new capacity for seeing these if and then patterns to invent jewelry, or to invent the bone flute, or to invent the bow and arrow, I think we needed another mechanism to explain a different aspect of human behavior. So in the case of the jewelry, we weren't just inventing a new object or a new system, but we were doing it for an audience. We were creating jewelry imagining how other people would see us, or we were creating jewelry to create an impression on another person. Perhaps we were creating the jewelry as a gift for somebody because we thought they might want it. And that kind of thinking isn't about systemizing, it's not about looking for patterns, it's about empathy. So the other big change in the human brain, which I think we can date to around the same period of 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, was the evolution of what I call the empathy circuit. Empathy you've all heard of, it's an English word, but what the science seems to be telling us is that there are at least two parts to the empathy circuit. The first is cognitive empathy, the ability to imagine somebody else's thoughts and feelings and intentions, to take their perspective that might be different to your own. The second part of empathy is what's called affective empathy, which is having an emotional response, an appropriate emotional response to somebody else's thoughts and feelings. And I think that empathy, particularly cognitive empathy, was again another uniquely human development arising from this empathy circuit in the brain, allowing what some psychologists called theory of mind, that's the cognitive part of empathy, keeping track of what other people might know and think and believe, as well as what they might intend or feel, and allowing humans, but rarely seen in any other species, to engage in behaviors that hadn't been seen before and what we don't see in other living species, such as deception. So children playing hide and seek, for example, and just loving doing it. Teaching, where we keep track of what somebody else might not know and think about what kind of knowledge do we have to provide, or what kind of information do we have to provide so that they have knowledge. Self-reflection, where we could think about our own thoughts and feelings and beliefs. Referential communication, very importantly, where we could communicate with words or gestures or symbols, even cave paintings, but with the intention that our audience, our listener, our viewer, would understand that when we're using this particular symbol, we intend it to refer to something particular. And we can do that in a very flexible way. And a whole range of other, much more complex social behaviors, all around having shared beliefs, knowing that other people believe the same, for example, the same goal, have the same shared goal as we do. But let me go back to the big question for this evening, and the main focus here is about invention. So the new question is there any link between autistic people and what I hope I've argued was a uniquely human capacity for invention? Well, when we look at autistic children or adults, we often see that they are fascinated by patterns. This is Max Park, who at 10 years old was fascinated by the Rubik Cube and was listed in the top 100 Rubik speed cubers in the world in terms of timed championships. Now that he's an adult and he's autistic, he's actually the #1 Rubik cuber in the world. This is despite his disability in social communication and in dealing with unexpected change in the social world. But his love of patterns seems to have given him not just strengths, but remarkable talents. And this is Derek Paravicini, who's also autistic. He's also congenitally blind, and he has a mental age of about a 3-year-old, so he's also got additional learning difficulties. But despite that, he can pick up auditory patterns. For example, as soon as he hears a jazz song being played, even just once, he can repeat it absolutely accurately, note for note, immediately. And if you ask him to transpose it from one key, B flat, to another key, G, he can do it incredibly rapidly and accurately. So his brain seems to be processing these if and then patterns in the auditory domain, just like we saw with young Max doing it in the visual domain. And this is Daniel Tammet. Some of you may have come across him because he's autistic. He's an author of a book about his own memory. And in particular, apart from having a remarkable memory, he's fascinated by patterns in numbers. He is the European champion for memorizing the number pi, which you can see in his background, that whereas most of us might be able to recite pi to 3 or 4 decimal places, Daniel recited pi to 22,514, but not underestimate his achievement, decimal places, which led him to be the European champion in this memory feat. It's worth noticing that he's not the world champion. There are others who've gone even further. So here's another example of someone who, despite his autism, his challenges in social relationships, in communication, he's showing a talent in pattern recognition and memory for patterns. Those are just sort of individual anecdotes, if you like, but when we've tested autistic people for their ability to understand a system, we also find superior performance compared to non-autistic people. So in this test, it's like a mechanical reasoning test. You're asked to look at this little mechanism where the wheel rotates anti-clockwise and predict what will happen to that point P. And it's a multiple choice test. The wheel is rotating anti-clockwise. So what will happen to that point P is it will move back and forth. So that's option C in the choices. And autistic people, as a group, on average, score higher on these tests compared to typical kids. Despite their disability in social skills and communication, they're outperforming typical kids of the same age. And here's another kind of test of patterns that we've given autistic people, where you have to find that cube as quickly as you can in the complex design above. So now we're talking about visual patterns. I can't trace it out for you because I don't have a pointer, unless I can use, I don't think you can see mine, but hopefully some of you can see the cube hidden in the design above. Autistic people are faster and more accurate on average than non-autistic people at this kind of pattern recognition. But to really test this on a big scale, we carried out something called the UK Brain Types Study. We asked 600,000 typical people online to take 3 questionnaires. The first is called the empathy quotient, or the EQ, which asks you how easily can you imagine somebody else's thoughts and feelings and tune into what someone else might be feeling. The second was the SQ, the systemizing quotient. How interested are you in a variety of systems, whether they're mechanical, like a computer or a car engine, abstract, like mathematics, natural systems, like the weather, even motoric type of systems, like playing golf, where there's a technique and a system to hitting the ball in an efficient way. So we gave those 3 questionnaires to over 500,000 people in the population. And in addition, 36,000 autistic people also took part in this huge study of what kind of brain, what type of brain do you have? What we found in this large study was, first of all, in terms of empathy, that scores were falling on a bell curve. That's to say, most of us are just average at empathy. We're in the middle of this distribution, but some people are above average over on the right-hand side of the distribution, and others are below average on the left-hand side. So the large graph is showing you the kind of schematic. The small graph in this slide is showing you the actual data from all of these hundreds of thousands of people. And you can see a small gender difference in this, that women on average were scoring higher on empathy than men. We also found a bell curve when it came to systemizing. That's to say, we don't all systemize as much as each other. Most of us are average in being in the middle of this distribution, but some people are systemizing much more than others. Their systemizing mechanism is tuned up much higher, so they're looking for the if and then patterns much more. And of course, other people are below average, hardly interested in patterns at all. And again, the data shows you a small sex difference, this time in reverse, that on average, males in the population are scoring slightly higher on this systemizing quotient than women. So here was one of the first surprises in the data, which is that when we took the 600,000 people and we looked at their occupations and divided them into those working in STEM, science, technology, engineering, or maths, and those not working in STEM, and looked at how they scored in terms of autistic traits, what you can see very clearly is that those working in STEM, shown in red here, have more autistic traits than those not working in STEM. So given that to work in STEM, presumably you need an aptitude at systemizing, at seeing those if and then patterns, this is showing us there's a link between aptitude in systemizing and how many autistic traits you have. Autistic traits, again, were distributed in a bell curve in the general population. So we all have some autistic traits. People with a formal diagnosis of autism just have a lot more autistic traits. So they score up at the extreme right on a measure of autistic traits. But here we were seeing a link, as we postulated, that the capacity for invention, which we see very clearly in the field of STEM, but not limited to STEM, also showed a link to how many autistic traits you have. Back to some anecdotes. When we think about inventors like Thomas Edison, as a child, was fascinated by Morse code, and in fact earned a living just as a telegraph operator, decoding Morse code, but obviously went on to invent many different things, most noticeably the light bulb, but many other inventions. But as an individual, biographies suggest that he might have had an above average number of autistic traits. His mother pulled him out of school when he was young because he wasn't coping in mainstream education, so she homeschooled him. As a child, he preferred to learn in a private way, just reading books in the public library, but he would do it in a very rigid, inflexible way, reading every book in order that they were on the bookshelves in sequence without missing out a single book. He became obsessed with Morse codes, which is, if you like, a very clear example of if and then patterns, to such an extent that when he had his own family, he named his first two children Dot and Dash. And his wife soon realized that part of how he operated, part of how he functioned, was to spend all day and all night systemizing, experimenting, so that she just moved the mattress into his workshop so he could continue into the small hours of the night. Some would say obsessively experimenting. I think that word is a little bit value-laden. I would say that he was simply focused to a much higher level on if and then patterns to find new patterns that might lead to a tool being better than a previous tool, improvements in the system. And these two scientists, Isaac Newton on the left and Albert Einstein on the right, both high achievers in terms of the world of physics, where you need to be a good systemizer to understand systems. Biographers have argued that both of them may have met the criteria for autism had it existed in their time, certainly had a lot of autistic traits. Isaac Newton, who was a fellow in my college in Cambridge, Trinity College, had according to biographers, quite a difficult personality. He didn't really get on with people very well, got into conflict quite frequently, and continued giving his lectures because it was part of his job description, even after students were no longer attending, so giving a lecture to an empty room. Albert Einstein didn't talk until he was 5, and language delay is often associated with autism, and often preferred to be solitary right through his adult life, preferring to focus on his work than on relationships. But these are anecdotes, and they're anecdotes from the world of technology or science. And well, I'll just give you one last anecdote, which is from a different world, the world of music. This is Glenn Gould, the jazz pianist, who, apart from being recognized as a terrific musician and pianist, also showed a lot of autistic traits. He had to eat the same food at the same time, in the same diner, at the same table every day, in fact every night. So he had a kind of inflexible, pattern-based approach to his everyday life. He had to take the same chair to sit on whenever he performed around the world, so that the chair was a precise relationship, angle, height, and feel to the piano. So a lot of quite inflexible aspects to his behavior. But diagnosing historical figures from their biographies is notoriously unreliable. I think what we need to do is focus on being able to test people who are alive and look for the patterns. First of all, back to that big study, the UK brain type study. What we found was that if you plot everybody along 2 dimensions, empathy and systemizing, what emerges are 5 different brain types. So the first brain type, shown in light blue here, is type E, where individuals are scoring higher in their empathy than they are in their systemizing. That seems to be about 1/3 of the population. A second brain type that emerged are people who we call type S, whose systemizing is at a higher level than their empathy. That's in light pink. And that seems to be another 1/3 of the population. In white, also about 30% of the population are type B, who are balanced, equally good at empathy and systemizing. And then at the top left-hand quadrant, we've got extremes of type E, people who empathize almost non-stop. As soon as they're with somebody else, they're thinking about what the other person is thinking and feeling. And even when they're not with them, they're thinking about what they might be thinking or feeling. But their systemizing might just be average or even below average. And then at the bottom right-hand quadrant in red, we've got an extreme of type S, people who systemize almost non-stop. Wherever they go, as they're walking around in their day, they're looking for patterns in the world, or experimenting with patterns, or pursuing work or hobbies that are all about playing with these if and then patterns. And yet their empathy may be just average or even below average. And what we found was that autistic people tended to fall either in type S, the systemizing brain, or extreme type S. So we were seeing a link between autism and a strong drive to systemize, which we've already argued underlies human invention. We had the opportunity to go one step further, which was to ask people who'd taken those questionnaires to also give us some of their DNA. We were able to do this by working with the genomics company 23andMe. Many of you will have heard of this company, where you can pay $100 to have a readout of your personal genome. So what we looked for was any association in your genetic code with how you score on the empathy quotient and the systemizing quotient. What we found amongst quite large numbers, 46,000 who gave us their DNA and took the empathy quotient, 56,000 who gave us their DNA spitting in a tube so we could extract it from their saliva, who took the systemizing quotient. We did find that there were some common genetic variants, so genes that we all carry but which occur in particular variations in the population, that showed a significant association with your score on the empathy quotient or the systemizing quotient. So whilst you might imagine that empathy or systemizing might just be the result of your learning and your experience postnatally, in fact, it's also partly associated with differences in your DNA, partly genetic. And finding that it's even partly genetic suggests that natural selection may have operated on these traits, perhaps because they conferred advantages to those individuals who scored high in either empathy or systemizing. The big surprise, and really relevant to the big question of this evening, is there a link between autism and invention, was that there were some common genetic variants that overlapped between those who scored high in systemizing and those who have autism. So the genes for autism are not just coding for autism, they seem to also be coding for an aptitude in systemizing or reasoning about if and then logic, the fundamental basis of human invention. The overlap was about 26%. Finding any overlap at all of a statistically significant to a statistically significant level shows that the links we were seeing at the psychological level are also being underpinned at the biological level. Here are some more pieces of evidence for the link between invention, systemizing, and autism, that when we look at the fathers of autistic children, we find that a significant number of them, a higher number of them, are working in the field of engineering. Engineering, of course, is an occupation where you need to be able to understand systems of one kind or another. And more than twice as many fathers of autistic children were working in engineering compared to children without autism. So this led to a prediction that if there's a genetic link between aptitude at systemizing in the parents and likelihood of having a child with autism, then we should find higher rates of autism in places like Silicon Valley, where people who are strong systemizers, I call them hyper systemizers, might move to work. Well, Silicon Valley is a long way away from where we are here in the UK. So we instead conducted our study in the Netherlands, much closer to home, and in particular looking at the city of Eindhoven. Eindhoven is of interest because a third of the jobs in Eindhoven are in IT, information technology. That's because historically the Philips factory has been located there for over 100 years, attracting people who are good at electronics and information technology. They also have the Eindhoven Institute of Technology there, which is a bit like MIT. So it's a hub for IT. And we compared autism rates in Eindhoven to two other Dutch cities, Utrecht and Haarlem, that were matched for size and other demographics. And what we found was that Eindhoven had more than twice the rate of autistic children in the population compared to the two other cities that were not IT hubs. Again, this is pointing at a link between parental characteristics, aptitude in systemizing, and likelihood of autism. But this is really just based on epidemiology and on school records in particular. So it isn't watertight evidence of a genetic link. I want to sort of finish my talk by thinking about autistic people today, because if it's the case, as I've tried to argue, that there's a link between autism and aptitude at systemizing or invention apparent today, and that link is partly genetic. It's likely that it was there right through human evolution, that autistic people or people high in autistic traits have played an important role in the evolution of human invention. And yet, when we look at autistic people today, the majority of autistic adults are unemployed. Many of them have talents, they have strengths, but they're unable to use them productively in our society. And if we stop and think about it even for a minute, we can easily see the reasons why, that society has not been a friendly place for autistic people. Many autistic people feel that they can't learn effectively in mainstream education. It's far too social, far too changeable, when they prefer to learn in a different way, through experimenting, through private study, or simply in a more predictable context. So many autistic people drop out of school, maybe before they have O-levels or A-levels, so they don't have formal qualifications, and that may be one barrier to employment, even though they have intelligence. Even those who get school qualifications, many of them end up unemployed, because even though they apply for work, there are barriers at the selection process. That when we interview candidates for a job, often we're looking for social skills, we're looking for eye contact, we're looking for good verbal communication, and yet these are part of the disability that constitutes autism. So employers may be unintentionally discriminating against autistic people on the basis of their disability. Lisa mentioned in the introduction that I'm an advisor to a company called Auticon, which stands for Autistic Consultants. That's a company that is a social enterprise where they only hire autistic people and try and place them in jobs that require good coding skills. But I think all sectors of employment could be making much more effort to rethink their selection processes, their recruitment processes, to think about how they could hire autistic people, to move society in a new direction. The National Autistic Society currently estimates that 85% of autistic adults are unemployed. And we know that unemployment by itself leads to poor mental health, whether you're autistic or not. Unemployment means you feel on the edge of society, you feel outside of society, excluded, you feel unvalued by society. It also means you don't have a wage, so you don't have autonomy and independence. And it's not maybe a surprise that most autistic adults suffer from anxiety and depression, and many of them report high rates of suicidal feelings or attempted suicide. So we need to change the way we structure society to make it more autism friendly, and that may mean supported employment programs for autistic people. I'm going to finish with what I think is a very important concept, the concept of neurodiversity, that autistic people are increasingly asking us to recognize that autistic people are not inferior. They're not disordered or diseased or broken, they're just different. That part of what I've tried to explain in tonight's lecture is that autistic people see the world differently, they think differently, they're much more drawn to the world of patterns than they are to the world of people and people's thoughts and emotions. They're different, but they're not lesser. And autistic people are asking for a very simple response from us, which is acceptance, respect, and dignity. Thank you very much for listening tonight, and I look forward to the discussion now and to hear your questions.